I made a video a few months ago talking about the Barbarian Hut, and how according to usage rates is the least popular card in the game. However, only slightly above the Barbarian Hut lies another card with a fairly similar function, the Goblin Hut. The Goblin Hut, like the Barbarian Hut, is one of the community's least favorite cards to see in Clash Royale, given its low skill ceiling and frustrating mechanic. However, despite the similarities it shares with the Barbarian Hut, their histories are distinct enough to where I think it deserves its own video. With the card's most recent changes, it has now had a total of 14 balance changes, which is the most of any card except the Witch. Supercell has certainly attempted to get the Goblin Hut into a healthy balanced state for many years now. So today I'm going to be covering the Goblin Hut's entire history, why it's so difficult to balance, the different meta decks it has been popular in, and what the future will likely be for this card. For the Goblin Hut's history, we need to start all the way back in Clash Royale's beta release on January 4th, 2016. Obviously, the card was very different than it is today after 14 balance changes, but the concept is still the same. It's a 5 elixir building that periodically spawns Spear Goblins. Since it shares the same troop as the Spear Goblins card, it posed a potential challenge when finding the perfect balance. The Spear Goblins and Goblin Hut were both in very different places in the meta upon the game's beta launch. To give you an idea of the difference, the Spear Goblins were the third most popular troop in top ladder with a 58% usage rate, whereas the Goblin Hut had a 17% usage rate. Remember, given the fewer cards that existed in the game back then, a 17% use rate was just about average for the time. Also, there really wasn't one specific deck the card worked in, as back then people were much more creative with their deck building. But you did very often see the Goblin Hut paired with the Barbarian Hut. This was known as the spawner archetype, where you basically sat back and kept applying pressure with more and more spawners while defending with other troops, to the point where you would overwhelm your opponents with swarms of goblins and barbarians. It wasn't uncommon to see Tombstone and Goblin Hut together either. Although the Hut cards had no more than an average use rate, it's safe to assume that this was not the case for the lower areas of ladder. Given the fact that spawners were typically easier to master than most if not all other decks, it made the spawner archetype very appealing to newer players, which at the time was everybody. But it wasn't just a lack of skill that made spawners so difficult to counter for some players. Another problem was that there was very few counters to deal with them at the time. Wizard was the best option you had, but he was 5 elixir and was quite fragile. Nowadays, there are so many better, cheaper options to deal with swarms efficiently, but this was a totally different era. Very early in the game's lifespan, the spawner archetype was almost unanimously hated. It just took way more effort on the defender's part than it did on the person placing the spawner, which just didn't seem fair. Since this was so early on, there are no recorded stats for the Goblin Hut in mid-ladder, but it's safe to assume based on old forum posts and from personal experience that spawners were a fairly common occurrence for people trying to push through the arenas. However, it was pretty clear that the statistics were not an accurate representation of the card's true strength at the time. Remember that nobody was really good at the game yet. Even an average player today could compete at the very top back then. As the first couple months went by, players started to get better, and it was soon realized that spawners weren't actually as good as they may have originally appeared. Within the span of a few weeks, Goblin Hut fell drastically from its average 18% use rate to a mere 6%. Of course, this didn't mean a lot of lower players still weren't seeing it often, but it does prove the card was maybe overhyped at first. However, despite this fall, the Goblin Hut would receive its first balance change on February 29th, 2016. This was a change to the Spear Goblins, where their sight range would be decreased from 6 tiles to 5.5 tiles. This change actually affected multiple troops, and this was implemented because defensive buildings were too dominant in Clash Royale, and Supercell really wanted to promote offense over defense. This change would make troops less likely to run towards defensive buildings, but it didn't make a huge difference, as this balance change was more to nerf defensive buildings, not make Goblin Hut viable. Thus, the card's use rate continued to fall. Spawner decks were getting easier and easier to counter by now if you knew how to play against them properly, and this was despite no nerfs to either of the Huts. One big reason why the Goblin Hut likely started to fall was the release of the Princess, who was a very popular 3 elixir card who was great at dealing with the waves of goblins. However, later in May, the Royal Giant would become a meta-defining card, and the Goblin Hut worked well with him in some decks. Some of these Royal Giant Goblin Hut decks were reaching the top ladder leaderboards, so thanks to the Royal Giants, the Goblin Hut wasn't completely dead. However, the Royal Giant was nerfed fairly quickly, and thus the Goblin Hut died as a result of that nerf. By July 2016, it sat sat at a 0% use rate in top ladder. By this point, there were just several more cards that were really efficient at dealing with spawners. The Goblin Hunt for months just continued to see absolutely zero usage in top ladder. Supercell wasn't quick on buffing it though, because players in general were not a fan of the card. Despite the card being irrelevant in the competitive scene, it wasn't uncommon to still see spawner decks in mid-ladder, especially with the brand new Furnace card that also came out in July. I mean, the Goblin Hunt had been considered viable for a while in the current state it was in and hadn't been changed much, so the smart thing seemed to be to let this card settle for a little while before taking any action. But it was clear as the year went on that the Goblin Hunt wasn't going to have any impact on the meta in the state it was in. For the rest of 2016, Goblin Hunt would get no balance changes, and it consistently remained around a 0 to 1% top ladder use rate. And even in lower ladder, spawner decks were becoming more and more irrelevant with each passing month. Supercell was still being very hesitant going into 2017 when it came to this card. But finally, on April 19th, 2017, over a year since the Spear Goblin's sight range decrease, the Goblin Hunt would appear in the balance changes and receive direct attention for the first time ever. It would get an HP buff of 5%, a rather small buff, but this buff made the Goblin Hunt able to survive a rocket. Before this, it actually had the exact same HP as damage the rocket dealt. This interaction didn't really matter though, as using spells on the hut was not a very common way people dealt with spawners. The way people dealt with spawners was by stopping the individual waves, but ultimately a buff is a buff, and this would help the card be a better defensive building. Again though, the card wasn't really used as a defensive building up to this point, so this buff was fairly insignificant. So even after this buff, the card saw no usage in top ladder. Now one thing to remember about the Spear Goblins is that they were very different from the Spear Goblins today. They just hardly did any damage back then, and even though in early 2016 they were practically ruling the game, they had completely fallen out of the meta despite no balance changes, as backed up by the fact that the Spear Goblins card had a 0% top ladder use rate now as well. Part of this drop-off was due to the Goblin Gang, a new card that was a better value for your elixir that included 3 regular goblins and 3 spear goblins. This card had a 44% use rate in top ladder at the time, and it was boxing out both goblins and spear goblins. If this card wasn't in the game, it would have made perfect sense to just buff the spear goblin troop directly. But because the Goblin Gang was so meta-defining, doing so would have had the unintended effect of making an already way too strong card even stronger. This is the problem that comes with having the same troop appear in multiple different cards. This is likely why Supercell opted to buff the HP of the Goblin Hut instead of the troop itself originally. At least with the Goblin Hut, the building can be used to balance that card separately from the other cards that included Spear Goblins. If Supercell really wanted to make this card viable, all they would need to do is increase the total number of Spear Goblins that would spawn from the hut, which can be done by increasing the lifetime of the building or decreasing the time in between intervals. But even though there were plenty of routes Supercell could go with this card while not affecting the Goblin Gang, there was still the problem of the Spear Goblins card. Supercell did not want to leave this card in the dust, so they were likely attempting to find the right balance between the Goblin Gang and the other Goblin Troop cards. And if they buffed the Goblin Hut too much now, then it may have caused problems if they did decide to buff the Spear Goblin Troop in the future to help bring back the Spear Goblins card, which would ultimately just force them to revert any buffs they gave to the building. Despite a pretty big nerf to the Goblin Gang in July, Spear Goblins were not doing any better. With the Goblin Gang not quite as meta-defining though, Supercell finally decided to buff the Spear Goblin troop directly on October 9th, 2017. This was a pretty massive buff, making the hit speed of the troop go from 1.3 seconds to 1.1 seconds. But even after this buff, both Spear Goblins and Goblin Hut didn't get much attention from the community until December. What happened in December was the Crown Tournament World Finals, where the Goblin Hut surprisingly made quite a few appearances. It was being used a lot with P.E.K.K.A. and Mega Knight. At this point, the community could clearly see the potential Goblin Hut really had to offer, but that wasn't the only major thing that prompted more usage of this spawner. This month also saw the release of the Royal Ghost, of which prompted the game into a new meta. A meta of which seems to greatly benefit the Goblin Hut. Over the next few weeks, the Hut's use rate in top ladder rose from a mere 1% to a staggering 15%, and almost every single appearance was in this one specific Mega Knight Royal Ghost deck. This deck was easily the most popular deck in the game, surpassing Logbait's, breaking its 3-month streak of being the #1 deck in the game. Although no other Goblin Hut deck at the time even came close to this Mega Knight one, some top players were also finding success with the Hut in Golem or Miner control. A 15% use rate may only sound slightly above average in terms of a healthy use rate, and for the time for most cards, it was. But in fact, the Goblin Hunt was actually the most popular building in the game at this point. Although the player base's attention during this era was primarily on the Royal Ghost, Supercell would not ignore this sneaky rise to a troublesome accomplice. 2018 was probably the most interesting year for the Goblin Hunt. The Goblin Hunt was so popular in December of the previous year that it would get an immediate nerf in the January balance changes. Its spawn speed would be changed from 4.95 seconds to 5.05 seconds, and ultimately this meant one less Spear Goblin would spawn overall. It may sound extremely small, but one less unit can make a big difference. Given the card's strength though, it may have been justified. But at the same time, it may not have worked as well if not for an overpowered Royal Ghost, of which was getting some hefty nerfs in the same balance change. The stats speak for themselves, and they suggest that this card was a bit much because only within a couple weeks of this change, the card's use rate in top ladder dropped to just 3%. Despite the low rates in competitive play, the card was actually still one of the most popular buildings in general ladder. It was an interesting situation because in the top 200, Tombstone was a more popular spawner than the Goblin Hut, but if you take the stats of the rest of the game into account, the Goblin Hut had a higher use rate than all of the other spawners combined. The hut still had a casual appeal, but it was relatively easy to beat if you knew what you were doing. I'd say the card was actually in an alright position for the moment, but come April, the card would be changed again. This was a 1/10 of a second hit speed nerf to the Spear Goblin's troop. This change was more so likely just to tone down the Goblin Gang and Spear Goblin's cards since they were very popular during this time. But of course, this had devastating effects for the hut. After this change, it was practically unseen in competitive play, hovering between a 0 and 1% usage rate. This saga was far from over, however, because Supercell was really bad at balancing the Spear Goblins, which prompted them to keep changing the troop. So the Goblin Hut got a major rework just 2 months after its April change. The Spear Goblin's troop was getting a major rework, with their hit speed being increased by 0.5 seconds, plus their first hit attack time increased by 0.3 seconds. To compensate, their damage was increased by 34% so that they could one-shot skeletons, and so minions died in 3 Spear Goblin shots. I think this rework would have potentially made the Goblin Hut game-breaking, since if left alone, the goblins would get one hit on the Princess Tower like they already did before, but it would deal so much more damage. The hit speed nerf just wouldn't have been that much of an issue on offense for the Goblin Hut, and Supercell realized this, so they decreased the lifetime of this card by 10 seconds, which meant if left alone, the Goblin Hut would spawn 2 less waves of goblins. As we've already seen from the January change, just 1 Spear Goblin can make a substantial difference, so decreasing it by another 2 just goes to show how much precaution Supercell was taking. But it was a bit too overboard because this card was even worse after this rework went live. It was probably the worst it's ever been up to this point, if not ever. The following month though, we got a new Rage game mode where the entire arena is under the Rage effect at all times, and all spawners were fairly popular in this mode, including the Goblin Hut. The reason spawners were so popular in Rage was because they would spawn extra waves of troops due to the Rage speeding up the spawn time intervals. But outside of that special game mode, you would hardly ever see it, so come October it would get a 4th balance change in 2018, decreasing the spawn time interval by 0.3 seconds. So in total, 1 more Spear Goblin would spawn. Given the Spear Goblin's damage buff, this meant now the Goblin Hut would deal the most damage to towers it ever dealt if left alone. However, despite that, the hut still had one of the lowest use and win rates in the game. Even if the units themselves were a bit stronger, having less of them was such a deterrent to the card that it could just not find a spot in the meta. That easily could have been the end of the Goblin Hut story. A card that was looked unfavorably by the player base left to die with the Wizard and Barbarian Hut. But Supercell wasn't ready to let spawners out to rot quite yet. 6 months after its last buff, in April 2019, Supercell would reduce the spawn time interval by another 1/4 of a second. So now the hut would spawn 12 goblins once again. This was partially done as a response to the Lava Hound meta. Buffing one of the best counters would hopefully put that archetype in check. Although players did laugh at the idea that Goblin Hut was supposed to be a good counter to Lava Hound, I don't think anyone disagreed that this buff was justified given its long-time underperformance. Remember, by now, it hasn't been competitively viable for about a year. Initially, the buff seemed to make the card good again. Getting its 12th goblin back definitely garnered players' interest. It was primarily being used in P.E.K.K.A. and minor decks. but it didn't take too long for this card to completely fizzle out of the meta once again, dropping to very similar rates that it had before. This was the only balance change that the hut would get in all of 2019, and its rates didn't really change for the rest of the year. In March the following year though, Seth, the head of balancing, put out a poll asking the community which long-term underperforming card they wanted to see get a buff, and Goblin Hut was an option. It ended up getting the least amount of votes, but history shows us that Supercell cares little about the player base's opinion, thus the Goblin Hut would be getting a rework in April 2020. A few months prior, in February 2020, the Barbarian Hut got a rework so that it would always spawn barbarians when its lifetimer was up. The card was relatively balanced and healthy after that, so Supercell thought this would also be a healthy change to the Goblin Hut. Supercell ultimately decided to make the hut spawn 3 spear goblins on death. They would reduce the lifetime by 10 seconds to compensate for this buff, keeping the total number of spear goblins that would spawn by an unanswered hut the same. It actually seems like a pretty fair rework, although some players were even questioning whether this would help. Nobody could have predicted how impactful this change was going to be, but they were ultimately going to find out. The rework unquestionably was a huge buff, and it was much bigger than anyone could have expected. This card went from a 0% use rate, a bottom 5 card in the game, to becoming one of the most overpowered game-breaking cards. Having 3 of those 12 spear goblins guaranteed to spawn no matter what helped it to get consistent value. The Goblin Hut was just such a strong defense, and it actually provided slightly more offensive value on top of that. You saw the hut in everything from Graveyard to Minor Control to Lava Hound, Elixir Golem, and Mega Knight Bait. For a 5 elixir building, it was incredibly versatile. The response from the community was far from pleasant. With Barbarian Hut being viable and Goblin Hut being so strong, people were strongly advocating for keeping spawners weak. This is not the direction that people wanted the meta to go in. Being balanced wasn't good enough. Players wanted them gone. This high performance and community backlash prompted Supercell to take drastic measures. So in the next set of balance changes in May, the Goblin Hut was going down. It received a 35% HP nerf. Before this change, it could survive a rocket, but now it couldn't even survive a lightning strike. However, if you did immediately strike a hut with lightning, you would at least still get 3 spear goblins unlike before April. Part of the reason Supercell went so harsh was because Earthquake was actually getting a rework to deal less damage to buildings, but they wanted to keep it strong against spawners. Of course, losing over 1/3 of your hit points is going to hurt, and with the May balance changes going live, Goblin Hut was back at square one. What place in this game could this card hold without upsetting players? What was the perfect balance for Goblin Hut? Players were talking about Goblin Hut, pointing out the obvious issue that there was no middle ground for this card. Spawners were either going to be useless or be a disruption to the meta, giving Supercell no choice but to leave the card the way it was, unless they could think of another creative way to rework it that would make it a healthy card. After this balance change, it seems like Supercell had no intention on giving any attention to this card. It remained as being statistically one of the worst cards, with virtually no player clamoring for its revival. Months would go by without a single balance change while players slowly forgot about the hut entirely. However, just when everyone thought the Goblin Hut was down and out for good, a miracle happened. Almost a full year since the hut's devastating nerf, it began to make a small comeback in April 2021. The Elite Barbarians and Mother Witch were both given substantial buffs at the end of March, and thus the meta was shifting. This Goblin Giant deck, and especially this Elite Barbarians double spawner deck, were trending. Goblin Hut was officially back in the meta. It wasn't crazy strong, but it had a niche and fulfilled it well for the time. With inevitable nerfs to the Elite Barbarians and Mother Witch, the rates of the Goblin Hut began to trickle down, since it was heavily relying on those cards being so strong. However, even after the nerfs, the rates didn't quite drop down to what they were before. The Mother Witch and Elite Barbarians were still fairly strong despite the nerfs they got, and Goblin Hut continued to have some success in Fireball Bait with the Mother Witch. You might think that once the Mother Witch got balanced out, the Goblin Hut would die again, but it continued to see niche usage going into the final months of 2021, even peaking as high as 5% in October. The card seems like it was in the perfect position. It was viable, but still a bit on the weaker side. But alas, right when things seemed like they were going alright, another meta shift was right around the corner. Despite the miniature success the hut was seeing throughout 2021, Supercell decided to give the card another balance change in the final set of balance changes in 2021 over a year and a half since its last change. For this set of balance changes, the hut would receive a lifetime decrease of 9 seconds, but its spawn time interval would be reduced by half a second. Its hit points would also be decreased by 17%, making poisons and earthquakes a much better counter to it. I'm not sure why Supercell thought this rework was necessary. They stated that spawners were leading to passive gameplay and frustrating battles, and didn't want people to be able to stack buildings when it came to double elixir. I can understand where they were going with this, but I think the lifetime and spawn time interval changes were fine by themselves. I don't see why the hit point nerf was necessary. Sure, it makes it easier to counter with spells, but without at least a little resistance to some of the bigger spells, how was this card expected to stand in the arena? As a result of this rework, the Goblin Hut's rates plummeted once again because it was just too fragile. The card saw little to no usage in competitive play, until a full year later, where it would appear in the December 2022 balance changes to get yet another rework, where now goblins would spawn in waves of 3 instead of just 1. The Goblin Hut spawn time interval would be increased from 4 seconds to 11.5 seconds, and its lifetime would be decreased by 2 seconds. This made it so it would spawn 3 waves of 3 goblins, plus 3 upon its death. This rework was heavily inspired by a barbarian hut rework from a few months prior, and Supercell even stated that the reason they were applying it to the Goblin Hut was because the barbarian hut rework was so successful. Which is pretty much exactly what they did back in 2020. I guess the Barbarian Hut is the testing ground for potential Goblin Hut reworks. I actually do love how proud of themselves they are for claiming how successful this rework was, because it implies that the Barbarian Hut is actually doing well, when in reality this rework put the Barb Hut in the worst position that it's ever been in. But I don't think the rework to the Goblin Hut was necessarily a bad direction to take it in. I think with less waves of goblins, it feels less annoying to go against because you feel like you have a little break in between waves. Ultimately, it seems like the rework helped the card a tiny bit, but it still wasn't really competitively viable and had pretty subpar rates. This month, it was occasionally seen in a Mighty Miner Fireball bait deck, but this appearance was brief because the Mighty Miner was vastly overpowered at the time and was quickly emergency nerfed mid-season. Goblin Hut was still underpowered, and with how infrequent Supercell even attempted to balance this card, and with each attempt ultimately being a fail, it didn't seem like Supercell was going to be giving this card any more attention anytime soon. But unfortunately for the balancing team, the hut was going to be standing in the way of some changes that they would want to make in the coming months. So for a little bit of context before we get into 2023, the Goblins card was reworked to include 4 goblins, while the Goblin Gang recently got its 3rd Spear Goblin back. The Spear Goblins card was vastly underperforming, and goblins were boxing out the Goblin Gang. Other cheap ranged units like archers were also just way better at filling the niche at the time. So the meta sort of settled into a position where all 4 Spear Goblin related cards were not doing well, which meant for the first time in nearly 5 years, Supercell was going to directly change the Spear Goblin troop. This was a simple range increase from 5 tiles to 5.5 tiles. This helped Spear Goblins connect to the tower faster, and one big interaction change this caused was that 3 Spear Goblins would take out any spirit. This also meant that damaged Spear Goblins that were 1 shot away from death by the tower would still manage to get a hit in. This change, to say the least, was definitely a more impactful one than Supercell could have expected. The Goblin Hut was so irrelevant up to this point that I don't even think Supercell thought about the potential impact this range buff would have on the card. And why would they? The Goblin Hut was the worst performing of the 4 Spear Goblin related cards, so if the buff didn't break the Spear Goblins, why would it have more of a drastic effect on the hut? That's what I'm assuming Supercell thought. When these changes went live, there was no instant splash in the meta, but over the next few weeks, the Goblin Hut's use rate in Grand Challenges steadily rose until it hit about 16% usage, making it the 12th most used card in the game. It was being seen a bit in this Mighty Miner Graveyard deck, but the deck that went on to define the meta for over a month was this Skeleton King Graveyard deck. One thing I've noticed with the Goblin Hut's history was that whenever it's in the meta, there's typically about 1 or 2 decks that it's seen in, but that doesn't mean that those 1 or 2 decks aren't seen everywhere. This doesn't apply to April 2020, but when you look back at April 2021 or December 2017, there's not really a variety in Goblin Hut decks despite being a popular card at the time. Another deck that became vaguely popular in May 2023 was this Goblin Hut Mirror deck, which seems like a troll deck given that the Mirror is not that good of a card, but it actually was an effective deck, and it notably used 3 of the 4 Spear Goblin related cards. Goblin Hut was officially meta once again. It was a surprise to many to see a spawner card performing so well in 2023, since it had been a good 2 or 3 years since any spawner had a real impact on the meta. This surprise was certainly not a pleasant one for many players. There were several posts in the community going viral of people not just expressing that Goblin Hut needed a nerf, but needed to be killed or removed completely. So finally, in June 2023, the Goblin Hut would get the last balance change it's ever received to this day. Its death goblins would be reduced from 3 to 1, meaning once again the Goblin Hut would only spawn 10 goblins if left alone. So how is the Goblin Hut doing today? With the June 2023 nerf and the introduction of evolutions, the Goblin Hut has some of the weakest rates it's ever had. It's the least popular card in the game right now besides its Hut brother, but it's not even that far ahead of that. It's safe to say that the June 2023 change took the card from being very strong to being borderline useless. But there haven't been too many complaints. The card is close to being in the worst position it's ever been in, and Supercell has not given any attention to it in about 4 months. It seems unlikely Supercell is going to be balancing the Goblin Hut anytime soon. This card has been reworked so many times, and yet it somehow seems to end up in the same place every time. It's a very tricky card to balance given the circumstances of how spawners are. If Supercell wants to make this card viable stat-wise, I think a small hit point buff or a second Spear Goblin on death makes the most sense, but given the community's reaction to them, I don't think Supercell wants to give the card even a small buff, no matter how much it may deserve it. The main issue is that players don't like a card that constantly chips away at them. The only idea I think potentially could make the Goblin Hut into a healthy card is to rework it to spawn normal goblins instead of Spear Goblins in waves of 2. To make it function more like a tombstone. The main problem seems to be the constant chipping, so this change fixes that. I'm not sure how you would balance the other stats out, but I think this is the direction a potential healthy Goblin Hut could be. Obviously the entire function of the card would be changed, but it's better than being completely useless. I'm definitely very interested to see if anything happens with this card or any other spawner. I want every card to be at least somewhat viable in competitive play, but there really does seem to be no hope here. I'm interested to hear some opinions on this, so let me know if you have any good ideas for potential Goblin Hut reworks, whether you think it should get a buff, or you think it should be left alone to rot for good. Thank you all for listening, and have a good one.